Welcome to the Mind Money Spectrum podcast, where your hosts, Aaron Agti and Trishul Patel, go beyond traditional finance questions to help you explore how to use your money to achieve the freedom you want in life.
Given that Trishul and Aaron release an episode each week, episode number 52 means they have been at this for one full year. In this episode, they recount their top 5 favorite conversations. They also look back and highlight some overarching themes. They discuss the importance of saving more and asset allocation, and why the concept of a spectrum keeps coming up again and again. But what they appreciate the most is how they have worked together to communicate knowledge and understanding, as they have explored the nuances and complexities behind a wide range of money-related topics. And now, on to our conversation.
Hi, my name is Aaron Agti. I'm a financial advisor in the Bay Area, and I'm here with Trishul Patel, a wealth manager on the East Coast.
Hey, Aaron, great to be here today, and thanks everybody for listening.
Great to be here as well. Today we are recording our 52nd episode, and since we do this once per week, that means that we have gotten through 1 year of weekly podcast episodes. And well, this was our goal at the outset, and I think we were confident we'd make it here. We want to kind of pause and just think back over the last year of recording these episodes. What are some of the things that Trish and I liked? What are some of the things that we really appreciated? And today we're going to kind of keep it very lighthearted and just this is going to be our 1 year retrospective. We both took notes, we both did homework on this, and we'll also have our favorite 5 episodes that we'll reference and make sure we put in the show notes. But it's going to be a nice, easy day. And so considering this is towards the end of 2020, we hope you appreciate it being a little lighter and easier. So Trishul, when you think back over the last year and the prior 51 episodes, what is the first thing that comes to mind for you?
Wow, I can't believe we made it. I remember when we first started this that we said, if we can make it to 8 episodes, that's probably going to be longer than the average podcast. What was it, 8 or was it like 9 or something like that, right?
I think 8 was the average, the median, so we just had to get past that.
Right. So we're like, okay, we can do this. We can get past 8. And, it just went very quickly. Yeah, in my mind, that they just started to build on each other and became part of our weekly routine. And before we knew it, I think we kind of just blew past a lot of checkpoints, like 10, 20, 30, 40, and we kind of blew past 50, to be honest, without even realizing it until we finished recording that one.
Yeah, I think it maybe wasn't intentional, but after talking about it, because we kind of committed to at least 8, we were committing to 2 months of episodes or 8 weeks of episodes. And I think that was a long enough time frame to establish that habit. Like that's been a big theme that we've come to, but I think that it wasn't necessarily like intentional of committing to that, creating the habit per se. It was like, oh, let's be better than the meat, like the bare minimum kind of thing. Let's set the bar really, really low and just clear that. But yeah, I think that I've appreciated this kind of weekly commitment to talking to you about different topics. And I was confident we'd get past 8, but I am pleasantly surprised we got a full year in. Like I could see how we could have petered out as we ran out of ideas, but I have loved talking to you for 45 minutes to an hour every week. So as we look back, kind of we go over our notes of some of the things we like, what were some of the things that you wrote down that you think about over all of our episodes?
Well, I think it's been a few things in my mind. One, it's given us the opportunity to kind of take a break from the workflows and the forms and the documents and just, have a conversation about things that typically we may not have the time to get into with every single client, or even in much detail as we would like to, just given time constraints. So I really enjoyed the opportunity to dig into a bunch of this stuff. And Aaron, like you said, it's also been possible because we kind of made this commitment, and it's been great to have an accountability partner on the other end to kind of shepherd this forward. So I definitely appreciate having that opportunity with you, Aaron.
You know what? That's a really good point. There have been a few times throughout the year that just kind of, I didn't quite feel it, but because you were expecting it from me just as much as I was expecting it from you, that accountability partner really has helped push through. I completely agree with that point, that making that weekly commitment, and I sometimes I'm not as prepared for some episodes. Sometimes I'm over prepared, but I have really looking forward to these, just the open-ended conversation aspect to it. That, like, I know I'm going to be going deep, and we've talked about how we usually have about the first 20 minutes or so kind of planned out, maybe sometimes only 15, but we always seem to be able to get over that 35 to 45 minutes of just regular conversation. And I loved how that has gone organically, and just see where the conversation takes us. So I completely agree about that commitment device and accountability partner aspect of our weekly recording.
Yeah, and the other thing that I want to tag on to that you mentioned is it's been interesting because we actually haven't scripted these episodes at all. It's been kind of to the point of, I have a few things that I think I want to say, and then you at the beginning you mentioned a few things. We're like, okay, that sounds good. Let's get going. And from that standpoint, you would think that there would also be a lot of editing and retakes and let's do this again, but we've pretty much hit the record button and we've stopped it an hour or so later. So I think that's been true for almost all of our episodes.
Yeah, and I have really enjoyed that aspect. That I think it has to do with just your and my interpersonal relationships. Just kind of, we see close enough on most things and disagree appropriately, but I truly enjoy talking to you every week.
Yeah, myself as well. I think we've mentioned this a few times. It's kind of like a form of therapy where you get to put your thoughts out there, and you get some sort of validation just by being able to speak it out loud and have a little bit of confirmation along the way.
That is one of the notes I wrote down related to one of the episodes I chose. What was that kind of sense of therapy for you and me? I feel like it's more so for me. I feel like I get more catharsis and relief from the conversations. So thank you for that.
Well, I'd like to thank you for that as well, because from my perspective, I also have all of these thoughts kind of swirling around in my head. And even if it's just a point I want to make about a specific notion that I've never got to communicate verbally, just having that opportunity, I think, is cathartic on its own.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's so many things that, because we are doing this just in this format, we're having the conversation. One, it allows us to get just a little more nuanced. We can go a little bit deeper. Whereas if we were trying to write it down, it would have to be kind of a little more formal. But the going back and forth allows us to explore some of those kind of off cases. We're also not trying to keep it short. So we're not trying to answer a question within 2 to 5 minutes. We really kind of take the time, we have the freedom to explore it. But also, you ask kind of just the right questions of me, and I ask the correct questions of you, that we can't just say something and take it at face value. We like have to support our thoughts. And I feel like that helps us formulate them and maybe find our own errors, or kind of when we have conversations in the real world or with clients, we can be a little more succinct about the things that matter because you and I have kind of fleshed it out. Here are the problems with this strategy. Here are the pros and cons. Here are the things I'm missing that I wasn't aware of. So I have liked that aspect as well. It's like, it's almost a accountability partner in our planning and arguments and opinions.
Yeah, and the fact that it is a longer format, I think really appeals to me. It's something where often I've seen a lot of frustration with other sources of information where it's always been kind of soundbitey, or it
Mhm.
doesn't provide the full context of, why somebody might think that way, or it just provides just the high level details, but there might be a lot more nuances to consider. So I definitely just cherish the opportunity to provide a stronger and more meaningful set of insights that may not be something that comes across traditional sources.
That's a great point. There are enough times where here is the default advice you see in the industry. We're going to kind of break it apart. Like here's maybe an off case that it might not apply. Here's a caveat that you want to consider. But after kind of we look at all the things, we almost end up at the same point. It's like, okay, so yes, that is really good default advice. And if you understand all the things that might apply to you and they don't, then you can follow that default advice. But I like the fact that we've acknowledged those, that it's not just agreeing for the sake of agreeing, it's actually going through all the other aspects. And it's okay if we end up with the same result because our process, I feel like it's a little better. I really like our process. I think it's one thing that's come up is just that process over results aspect. And for us, it's kind of a conversation process or a logical process or like a financial planning argument and advice process that I appreciate, even if it ends up at the oversimplified result.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the other aspect I kind of like about these conversations is it kind of ties back to our title to begin with, the mind money spectrum. And
Yeah.
it's just this notion of there's these competing concerns that always come up throughout life, and often they involve money and how we approach money. And it's this notion of there typically isn't a black and white solution, like a one size fits all solution that fits every situation. It comes down to personal preferences, personal behaviors, individual behaviors, and how we approach things. And also there's a lot of biases involved that need to be waded through. And then, of course, there's also what kind of makes sense in terms of a rational observer of these things. And just tying all that together is hopefully what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and that actually kind of brings me to the first of my 5 favorite episodes that I wrote down. I actually put our first episode, where our original discussion on fire, because I felt that sent us down the path of thinking in terms of the spectrum. Because when we first started recording, we didn't actually have a name for our podcast. We just kind of, let's record a few episodes, get a few in, and kind of see how the conversations go. But that first episode really kind of started us down that path. It was the idea of, I was ready to disagree with you on fire pretty strongly, that there was enough other things there, but kind of you helped me understand, like, there's different versions and there's a lot of good sound financial planning principles. And we've kind of talked about the lean fire versus fat fire. And I kind of realized I'm in favor of saving more, having good asset allocation, being conscious of your expenses, and being financially independent in your 50s. And it's like, that felt like normal financial planning advice, but it was the just kind of one end of the spectrum within the fire conversation, that financial independence, retire early. So that's why I put the first episode as one of my favorites, because it led us down that path of thinking in terms of the spectrum. So what was the first episode you wrote down as one of your favorites?
Oh, you kind of stole my fire there.
Is that pun intended?
I guess. Yeah, it was that first episode for me as well. I did this chronologically, so they're not necessarily ranked, but
Same for me.
I did like that first episode for many of the reasons that you mentioned. And I actually forgot what you mentioned a few minutes ago, we that's right. We didn't have a name for this podcast until like 6-7 episodes in, if I remember now. I remember we just kept recording week after week, and then at some point we're like, maybe we should probably get a name on this.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like that first episode because of the reasons you stated, and also it's just an interesting philosophy to me where it sounds pretty simple. The notion is the more you save, the more quickly you can, or the sooner you might be able to reach financial independence. And it just ties into a lot of the philosophies that I've been trying to follow just in my personal life and just put forward within my business. And it's just bringing forward this idea that one of the big knobs that people have within their lives that they can control is the amount that they end up saving. And it can make just a huge difference where the typical household in this country may save less than 5%, which means you're probably going to be working 66 years. And that's a long time. But if you can save 10%, then you may only have to work 50 years until you can retire. And what if you could save 20%? Well, now you can cut off the amount of years you may need to work by half by just saving from 5 to 20%. And it's certainly possible. Imagine you have a paycheck increase, a 20% paycheck increase. Well, if you put all of that towards savings, well, there you go. And if you hold on to that 20%, you could cut your time you need to work in half. And it just kind of gets more and more interesting if you follow that train of thought, meaning if you end up saving, 50% of your income, you could be out of the rat race in 17 years.
Yeah, I agree with the math. I still think that a 50% savings rate is more aggressive than necessary, but 5% is too low. So like something in that 15 to 20% is great. You actually tied in two of the notes I have, kind of overarching themes of all of the episodes. Kind of save more is kind of the single biggest piece of advice. Second kind of was like asset allocation. Like if you can get those two pieces right, everything after that felt kind of marginal or an optimization. Like if you just save more and had the right asset allocation, you're so far on the path that you don't necessarily, like if you get the other little things wrong, you're still going to be in great shape. And the other thing you mentioned, I wrote down the serenity prayer, and we've talked about this past, but it really is just a way to help focus on the things you can control. And that saving more and the asset allocation are part of that. And those are just the huge themes of the overall advice that we give and the philosophies that we have. Just saving more. And again, kind of from that fire, it could be 50%, could be 12%, could be 15%. Like just saving more is so impactful. Asset allocation matters. But then kind of people worry about making all the other little things right. And even if they get them wrong and kind of have a suboptimal tax strategy, they're still going to be in great shape. And that's one of the things I did like from our conversation on fire is just when you focus on the right things and the things you can control, while you don't have to be saving 50% and getting out of the rat race. I didn't like that phrase because there are other ways of living your life without having to save 50% to get out of the rat race. Like you could just find a different job, but the emphasis on managing expenses and saving more was something that really did appeal to me. So I did like that you kind of convinced me that a fire strategy is just the kind of nomenclature for a variety of sound financial planning principles. And just like everything else, you can take it too far, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad.
Yeah, good stuff.
So what was your second your next favorite episode in chronological order?
Well, the next one is actually episode 2.
Okay.
So the title of this episode was Buying Stocks for Fun. And So it says basically buying stocks can be fun, but don't fall into these common traps. And what we tried to kind of highlight in this episode is the notion that it's something I put forward in a blog post way back. And the title of that blog post was The World's Most Expensive Hobby. And what I called that expensive hobby is just investing in stocks in general, basically following an actively managed strategy versus a passively managed one. And the reason I kind of like this episode a lot is it helped me put out there a lot of color on why I feel that way. And it kind of ties back to a lot of research that underpins my philosophy of keeping it simple, lean, and mean and long term, and also investing in a passive manner, meaning not trying to outsmart the market, but just trying to match the market. And the high level notion is actually, again, pretty simple. It's this notion that individuals who try to beat the market on average end up doing worse by about, if you're an average household, you probably might underperform by 1.5% a year. And that doesn't sound like much, but if you're going to be investing over a lifetime, which if you plan on accumulating wealth and retiring and maybe passing some on, that certainly would make sense for most people. 1.5% over a lifetime can be quite massive. Just take 1.5% and multiply that out by 40 years, and 1.5 times 40 is 60%. You're giving up 60% over 40 years on that initial investment. But, there's compounding there as well, meaning that additional money loses that effect of being able to compound because it kind of disappears from your pocket. So it's not only that you're down 60%, if you add in the compounding, you're down over 80% on where you would be. Meaning, if you had $1 million by the end of, this 40-year period, you could have had 1.8 million. That's a big $800,000 hole that you could probably fix by just trying to be a little more passive. And quite frankly, what we've kind of shown is it's not only easier to do, it's easier to manage, and there's plenty of other efficiencies that can go with it beyond just this 1.5% loss in return. There's all these tax advantages that we've talked about in many other episodes. So that I think that's why the second episode was a good, let me get this off my chest and, let's kind of move on to some other more important things, but it was certainly some low-hanging fruit in my mind.
I didn't have that as on my list, but one of the things that did come up that just came to mind, because I've written on about buying stocks for fun, and kind of as long as you are saving for all of your goals, and you have the extra money, it can be a way that you actually get joy and pleasure out of it. But because I talked to you and kind of was able to formulate out my thoughts, I was actually interviewed by a writer from fatherly.com. They found me because of my article on my website about buying stocks for fun, but I made sure to specifically talk about the opportunity costs, that kind of missing 1.5% that you're talking about, that I hadn't quite thought about it before, but the idea is like, just even though your stocks went up, you might have made money, but you might have made more with a passive diversified strategy. And so if you really want to kind of understand, was it good, even though your stocks went up, did you make a good investment? You really need to think in terms of that opportunity cost. And because you and I had that conversation, I was able to more effectively stress some of these points when I was interviewed for that article. And kind of like we talked about earlier, my conversation with that writer was better because you and I talked about it. And I also remember from that episode, kind of, I was in favor of it and you were against it, but I don't own any individual stocks right now and you do. And I still kind of chuckle at the irony of that distinction between us.
Yeah. So in more full disclosure, I'm basically down to one stock.
Okay.
So I've been slowly transitioning that way. And I'd mentioned those stocks I did hold, they're just legacy positions that I've held on more because of, as a reminder of not to invest in stocks, and also the fact that I had some basis built up in there.
Yeah. Okay. So what was your, oh, sorry, that was your second favorite episode.
Yeah.
So,
what do you got, Aaron?
Again, I also did in chronological order. My second favorite episode was the number 13, our conversation on real estate. That felt kind of like the first two, where it was you and I, again, disagreed the right amount, but because we had the time for our deep dive, I've actually shared that episode with a few clients and prospective clients that they're thinking about investing in real estate, and there's so many little nuances, pros, cons, understanding leverage, the psychological aspects of being a landlord, the cap rates versus kind of estate planning and legacy. And I really kind of am glad we fleshed all of those conversations out, and especially sharing our personal experiences as landlords, because I can now more effectively have that conversation with clients when they have rental real estate. And I that's kind of high on my list, and I think it's the one I have shared most with other people specifically. Like, we'll have a conversation, you know what, I have a longer conversation that helps understand all the depth. You might be interested in listening to this episode specifically. So that's why the real estate conversation, owning individual properties, number 13 was the second favorite episode on my list.
Yeah, that's a good one. I've actually, frankly, I think I've shared that one a good amount as well, for likely the reasons that you state. And it does also make sense to me, just thinking through it out loud, that we kind of know this, where the average household has most of their wealth in real estate, in this country at least. And that's because buying a home is very much encouraged by our government through certain incentives, or at least was encouraged, and also the favorable rate environment. And it's this notion of familiarity, where if you own, your own home, and you understand the kind of dynamics there, you can kind of think through the math of, okay, what if I had another one of these things, but somebody else was paying for the mortgage? So I can see how that situation comes up in a lot of people's minds. Came up in my mind when I first got into real estate, 15 or so years ago. And there's a lot that I've learned since then about all the complications that kind of go into it. So I'm glad that we have that conversation to lean on.
Yeah. So what's next on your list? What's your third in chronological order of your 5 favorite episodes?
So I'm going to jump forward a little bit. So this is episode 27. Can a universal basic income really pay for itself? And this one doesn't really have much to do with personal financial planning. It's more of just like a thought piece on what is this notion of providing a basic income for every citizen, and just what are the ramifications of if we were to do this. And I think I liked it because I think we have this overarching concern, or at least I feel like there's a strong concern in my mind of, where is our society going to go given the strong income inequality? But also, where is the society going to go given the fact that we as humans may get to the point where it's so productive that there may not be that much work to be done? So it just allows us to think a little bit forward on, okay, how does this play out for the next generation and thereafter? And I think that UBI conversation opened up a lot of these different thoughts that I thought were pretty interesting to think about.
I think that might be the first episode I remember you talking about the idea of kind of testing and experimentation, or like evidence-based policy making, that we didn't have to implement something for across the entire country, but it might be worth exploring. Like, it's a sounds like a good idea, and there's different ways we can test it out before implementing it at a large scale. But at the very least, not just dismiss it out of hand. Let's kind of figure out, does it work, or what are some of the unforeseen consequences. And that idea has stuck with me a little bit, because I think it sounds like a good idea, but there are enough issues that I'm concerned about. But, and again, we talked about all those in the episode, but I do agree that, you know what, we can probably introduce some testing and experimentation at the public policy level.
Yeah, we did introduce that notion of, evidence-based legislation. And in my mind, I feel like a lot of the legislation that we've seen in the past has kind of been emotionally based, meaning,
Mm-hmm.
Something bad happens, let's quickly react to it and kind of hope for the best. Whereas we realize, or it's not too hard to realize, that there might be a better way to go about putting policies in place. And I mentioned this in like a later episode, where there's been studies now that have gone back and looked at all of these various, social programs. That I believe this Harvard study that we had mentioned looked at over 100, and it actually looked at them many years on, looking at all of the after effects, and it came to realize there are many programs that in fact are positive in terms of net present value, meaning they'll add more value in terms of even income coming into the government than it would cost in terms of spending going out. So, the high level notion is, let's find those programs and give them as many dollars as possible. And let's shift the money away from those other programs, which, for every dollar in, we lose money. And as a society, we might be better off.
Yeah. So my third favorite episode in chronological order was number 18. We talked about kind of the spectrum between happiness and well-being. We talked about kind of meaning in life, and it was a kind of a topic I've been thinking about for a long time. Just this idea of happiness implies content with your current situation, but so much of well-being and meaning was almost a little kind of related to ambition of looking to improve yourself. And I kind of had trouble kind of putting together those two thoughts, because I think they were both important. And since then, that was the first episode kind of really talked about it, but we've also had this idea of kind of improving for the sake of improving can both help with your happiness, where if you aren't setting some goal to be disappointed or to strive for, but if you're improving just for the sake of improving, you're kind of achieving both of those. And it doesn't have to be all one or all the other. Like, it is a spectrum, and you can choose where you fit in your life and what you want out of your own life. But that idea that we kind of apply the spectrum, but I look in so much happiness research, and that is really important to me. But you still have to kind of have this drive for how you determine your personal value and your self-worth. And just being happy, although there probably were some that are kind of derive their self-worth from being happy, but most people is kind of somewhere else on the spectrum, that they want to be happy, but also they want to improve something and kind of work towards something like that. It's okay to have both of those seemingly contradictory goals or seemingly contradictory drives.
Yeah, that episode was certainly more philosophical, but I like the fact that it tied into this notion of what we're trying to do as financial planners or advisors is not help our clients get as much money as possible, but hopefully what we're trying to do is allow our clients to formulate a plan so that they can live their best possible lives. Meaning, what ultimately would provide them with not only the most happiness in the short term, but the most meaning in the long term.
Yeah, I think this was that's a great point when it comes to advice we give to clients. This is almost how we think about the fighting the keeping up with the Joneses aspect. growing your net worth for the sake of growing your net worth doesn't improve your life. It's understanding what do you actually want out of life, not as a comparison of like keeping up, growing more money, higher rate of return, spend more, but focusing on what are the things that make you happy and where do you find your meaning, and that kind of spectrum within well-being. That just thinking about this and having the conversation, that does not necessarily in the same depth that you and I did, but something like that with clients does really help them kind of use their money for the life they want rather than getting more money for the sake of having more money.
Right. Yeah. I definitely see it from that perspective.
So what was your fourth favorite episode in chronological order?
Okay, so this would be episode number 38.
Okay.
The title of this one is "The U.S. Tax System is Screwing You Over. Here's what you can do about it."
Oh, quick side note. I've had conversation with friends who have listened to the podcast, and all of my friends who know me know I don't come up with these titles because I'm the literal, here's what this episode is about, and you are the almost clickbait style, like how to get your attention. And everyone who knows me knows that, yeah, the other advisor must be coming up with these titles because Aaron can't do that.
Well, it's a skill I actually had to pick up. I remember when we were first thinking about the titles way back, when we were thinking, a little more literal, and then we did some research and we realized that, yeah, at the end of the day, this is what works. This is what actually drives people to get past the title and actually listen. So it's something that we've adopted. And I've actually had to browse articles on clickbaity websites for ideas. So I can't take all the credit. I've certainly borrowed from notions that I've seen in terms of what's gotten me to click.
Okay, so going back, what was episode 38 about the U.S. tax system screwing you over?
Well, I think this was another one of those off my chest episodes where the common theme that we always hear is that we have a progressive tax system and the tax rate for the rich is very high. The highest marginal tax bracket is 37%. If you're wealthy, you're paying 37% on your income. And how could you pay any more than that? But what we tried to introduce in this episode and the one right before this is just the notion that it's not only about the marginal tax rate. There's a lot more that goes into taxes to figure out what individual will actually pay. And if you're wealthy, you might end up paying far, far less. And we've showed all the various ways where that could happen. I can't remember if this was but wait, there's more in terms of all the things that we've routed out. It was probably this one or the one, right next to this, either before or after. But what we tried to distill, or what I was trying to come across with this episode, is the notion that you can potentially generate mass amounts of wealth by paying a far lower tax rate than an average individual who relies on a W-2.
Mm-hmm.
And from that perspective, our tax system is not progressive at all. It's highly regressive. We outlined ways where you can effectively get pretty wealthy and pay almost nothing. And I think it's just a notion where a lot of these things exist and they're all kind of legal and they're not necessarily gray. It's all kind of black and white, but it's something that's not always understood when these conversations come up on, is the marginal tax rate for the highest income earners too high or not?
Yeah, I think this 38 was the second of those two episodes, and I have kind of summarized it in. I've created the soundbite that I like, but the U.S. tax system kind of hurts income earners, like you talk about those W-2 employees, and helps people who are already wealthy, kind of who have the assets already. It's also kind of in that respect also helps business owners' perspective, because again, if that business is one of their assets. It helps them in terms of their taxes. I've had conversations with clients and prospective clients that they're both husband and wife are working. They're very successful. One's a doctor, one's an engineer, and they're making a few $100,000. Like, what can we do to reduce our taxes? And it's like, well, kind of other than maxing out your 401ks and kind of certain charitable giving for W-2 employees, there really isn't that much that they can do. But if the doctor, it's kind of like what ER doctors go to. So it's kind of not one of my favorite episodes. We talked about like the health insurance aspect, but if you go to the ER doctor may not be under your insurance, even though the hospital and the ER is. But one of the reasons is that for the doctor, it might actually make more sense for them to create their own LLC. And so now they're the owner of the LLC, and the hospital or clinic hiring them isn't hiring them as a W-2 employee. They're actually contracting with the business, that LLC, that the doctor owns. And actually, that by changing from W-2 employee to a business owner, even for the same service, introduces significantly more tax opportunities. And there's just one quick example of what you're talking about. The U.S. tax system really is designed to help those who have assets and the owners of things, and it's significantly higher rates on people who earn income for a living.
Yeah, we certainly dug into a lot of the nuances, but I like the way you captured, that soundbite. It's just this notion of if it was set up the way it was intended, then all well and good. But my guess is most people wouldn't agree that this is what they want in terms of a system.
Yep. So my fourth favorite episode was going back to number 28. This is one where we kind of talk about if you're saving for private college and grad school at a private university, it is possible that you could actually have $1 million in terms of total costs for education. Now that's kind of arbitrarily high, but kind of for the purpose of our example, if you could save up $1 million to cover undergrad and grad school at a private university, which it is possible to spend that much on education, would your 18-year-old be better off with $1 million that at a 3% withdrawal rate could generate $30K per year? So kind of create your own little UBI on an individual scale, or would they be better off with the actual education they're getting, going through undergrad and the PhD? And I liked this because it was a really fun thought experiment that tied a lot of things that we had talked about in previous episodes, that kind of the UBI aspect, kind of our own personal experiences. Would we have been mature enough? And you talked about how you felt you learned more from work than you did from college, but I don't think I would have been mature enough at 18 to kind of use that appropriately. That I needed the learning how to learn aspect that undergrad gave me, but it was worth it to have the conversation. It's kind of, and it fits an idea like education is, for the sake of education, may not be the be all end all. That it's part of some kind of cost benefit analysis, even if you can't actually come up with numbers of like what your income might be after college, but you can make guesses. But it was a really fun thought experiment, and I'd be curious. I'd love to get other people's perspective. We ever have more guests, but that idea of, would you rather go back and have $1 million as an 18-year-old providing $30,000 per year, and you're going to try and get life work experience starting at 18, or would you rather have all of your education funded, and which would provide the life that you wanted more effectively?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I like the fact that, as you said, it did tie in many overarching themes that we've had across a handful of episodes around that time. The big theme that went through my mind as you said that was we did speak about this big concern about income inequality, and that tied into the notion of the UBI episode I mentioned. And it's just this big concern that education costs and living costs like real estate and healthcare costs have all been increasing higher than the cost of inflation,
Mm-hmm.
to the point where, a generation ago, maybe it was taking up 30% of somebody's household income, and now it's closer to 60%. And if the trend keeps going, then, will our kids be spending 120% of their income to support these three things? And obviously there has to be a breaking point somewhere. There has to be some sort of better solution to this probably inevitable problem that's going to surface or is already surfacing. So either the system will break or massive things will change. And this was definitely a good example of that kind of playing out as a thought experiment.
Yep. So what was your last or most recent favorite episode?
So my most recent, and frankly, when I started picking this list earlier today, I actually had about 10, so I just had to quickly narrow it down. So that I did enjoy a lot of them, even the ones that you had mentioned, Aaron. And but this last one is episode 41. What does academia have to say about what really works when investing in stocks? So the reason I like this is because I feel like there's two sets of knowledge out there and two sets of communications out there and two sets of notions that kind of put out there. One is kind of what does the research say that drives a lot of papers and journals and PhD theses and studies and all that. And then kind of what do you hear on like Wall Street in terms of, all right, here's what you need to do if you have X, Y, and Z problem. Here's the product to fit your money migraine. And I feel like there's a strong distinction between these two groups of thought. And frankly, what I tried to hopefully outline in this episode, what we kind of discuss in this episode as well, is the notion that we've come a long way with investing theory over the past 90 years. And there's a lot we do understand at this point in terms of what works and what doesn't. And I think this episode tried to kind of outline that what we're trying to say, it may at the end, sound simple, but there's a lot that underlies the rationale on how we got to where we got to. Currently, there's about maybe $7 trillion invested in these types of mutual funds and active funds and passive funds. And currently about half of that is invested passively and half is invested actively. And what we've come to realize based on just the research is that 3.4 trillion in active funds is not likely to do any better than the other 3.4 trillion in passive funds. In fact, the more fees that are embedded into those active products are more likely going to detract from actual performance over time. And, we mentioned that compounding effect that over a lifetime can make a pretty big difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember that. It's the markets are efficient, except when they're not. But you can't know that. So if you're actually trying to apply anything, there's kind of the opportunity to apply any particular strategy just doesn't tend to pan out. And so the passive strategies, especially after accounting for fees, tend to work out pretty well. And it was really good because I think especially the idea that these investing strategies, some of the original academic research is, I think it was almost 90 years old, something like that. And some of these ideas still hold. And there's a component of just kind of human behavior in the stock market investing that these strategies are really aware of or taking advantage of. Again, like you said, there were a lot of Nobel Prizes won from this research, but just trying to apply those research kind of once the Nobel Prize was awarded, then the strategy itself was kind of almost priced out, if that makes sense, where it's kind of keeps coming back to just asset allocation is the most important part. And as long as you take care of asset allocation, that's kind of the thing that you can control.
Yeah, kind of tying into that first of the 2 points, Aaron, you made at the beginning of this episode, savings and asset allocation. And that's a very good point. This episode ties into that notion of, focus on asset allocation. But by the way, I messed up that 3.4 trillion number. It's 4.3. That was just my dyslexia getting in the way of it.
We appreciate you correcting it for all of our listeners.
Okay. So Aaron, what's your number 5?
For me, let me pull my notes again. It was number 35. This was where we're talking about kind of how parents are dealing with COVID. I remember at the time, didn't know if my kids were going to go back to school. We didn't know if schools would be open. We didn't know if there would be a hybrid model. Didn't know if it'd be safe. And this was probably I chose this as the best example of, I don't know that you and I actually gave any actionable advice or valuable advice, but talking it out with you helped me so much. This was like the like best example of our own personal therapy session that has played out several times over the year, where just having someone to talk to, kind of thinking about risks, rewards, benefits, pros, cons, and having that conversation, even if it didn't come to any advice or any recommendations. I think how we have that conversation, how we think, does help listeners in terms of being willing to kind of expand their thought process. But directly, like I genuinely felt better after talking to you about it than coming into that conversation. Like I know I didn't actually come up with any conclusions, but that was the best example I found of these conversations acting as like a mini therapy session for you and me.
Yeah, that episode was certainly a great example of that. It ties into this notion that, back to this serenity pair, this is just a situation where there's a lot we can't control. With COVID, it's just putting it out there where there probably is no right answer to a lot of the tough decisions that we have to make. And, as a parent, this is something we kind of need to tell ourselves from time to time, kind of anything goes. What you need to do is probably what you can do, and what you can do is probably the best solution for what you're dealing with.
Yeah, I still have the same feeling of just, just get through it. It's okay. It's okay to have kind of lots of bad feelings. It's okay to have lots of good feelings. It's okay to kind of, things don't have to be right. Things can kind of feel wrong, feel bad. There's a lot of indecision, a lot of stress, anxiety, and that's okay. Thank you for that.
Well, good stuff.
So as we wrap up, do you have any other little notes of things that you thought about over the year, or things that you wanted to think back on?
Well, I have some statistics here actually from our website, so I thought I might throw that out there in terms of what is our podcast actually experience in terms of viewers, or not viewers, listeners, and over the past year.
Okay, go ahead.
All right, so at a high level, we have about 1,353 listens across all 51 episodes. And as it turns out, Aaron, your and I first pick that fire episode was our most popular.
Mm-hmm.
At about 99 listens. So just
we couldn't even get 100.
Yeah. I was tempted. Should I listen to that one again? I'm like, no, I don't have time for that. But just some other interesting things to note is we're actually listened to in 6 out of 7 continents across the world.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, we have yet to have a listener in Antarctica, but we'll work on that for the next year. That can be our goal.
I can try to think like, is it the ozone layer or penguins or like I'm trying to like all to think of like what topic could even apply to Antarctica.
Well, it's my understanding that there are research outposts there, so they're likely do
I think
have.
I got it. It's the saving up for the trip to Patagonia and the trip down to Antarctica.
Sure, but don't listen to it until you get there. Otherwise, it doesn't count for us.
Oh, dang it. Okay, so what other stats do you have?
Well, so just dovetailing on that though, about 80% of our listeners are from the U.S., which I would have kind of expected that to be a bit higher.
Yeah, I'm saying the same thing. It's like I'm surprised it's not higher.
Yeah, and the top 3 countries beyond the U.S. are France, Sweden, and Norway. So it looks like we have a handful of listeners in Europe that are kind of paying attention to us a little bit.
That I'm trying to think like what we've talked about that might apply to France, Sweden, Norway.
It's hard to say.
UBI aspect or some of the kind of tax conversations.
Maybe, but I think the same advice kind of applies globally. That a high-level notion of the 2 knobs you can control are just savings and asset allocation. So that's probably true wherever you are on the planet.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So just a few more stats. Our top 3 episodes across all of them in terms of listens. I mentioned the first one. That's that episode 1. What's the big deal about fire? The second highest listen is actually episode 4, where it's titled Aaron and Trishul Get Personal. So, for whatever it's worth, that's also one of those episodes where maybe it's more of a therapy session for each of us. And then the third episode, our third highest listened to episode, is the episode number 2, Buying Stocks Can Be Fun, but Don't Fall Into These Common Traps.
Okay. So
just some interesting stats that I thought might be helpful to kind of share with our listeners.
That's a good point. Now I'm wondering, is it people trying out our podcast and giving up after 4 episodes?
Well, if we look down a bit, one thing to realize is the longer an episode has been around, the more listens, obviously.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So this doesn't quite normalize for that. I could normalize for that, but then we have a bunch that just haven't been around enough, so the sample would be small. We could probably do that next year.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll leave that to you.
Sure.
You know what? If we had, you know what? That's not true. That does appeal to me. That does interest me. It's like if we can capture that data and account for time, like, yeah, we can probably figure that out.
We could, but we can nerd out on that at some later point.
Okay. Any other stats or notes or tidbits?
I think that's kind of it. I don't know how useful this stat is, but it does say our average episode should expect about 50 listens. So, maybe that implies about 50 people are listening to us now.
Okay. That's on the scale of, I guess, what we were hoping for after a year.
I guess so. So if we look over time, I remember early on it was just a handful, and then we have been seeing this kind of exponential growth, as you should expect over time. So that part is encouraging.
The one last little note I had was just, I still remember chuckling at you bring up various Buffett quotes, and it's like I would try to ask, was it Jimmy Buffett or Warren Buffett? And I don't know if the joke ever stuck, if it like to become like an inside joke, but it made me laugh. I still chuckle at it.
Well, we can kind of tie that into season 2. The other thing I wanted to ask you is, how many tabs do you have open right now?
Okay, so I have 6 windows open. one is the podcast, so I only have one tab. Next one has 3, so I want 4. Then another 4 is 8. Then another 6 is 14. Then I'm gonna looks roughly like 14, so I'm probably at 28. And then probably another 14 to 16. So I'm probably like 45 tabs open right now.
That's a healthy amount. That's probably in the mean, or one standard D from the mean.
Oh, let me check my phone real quick. That's okay. I don't think I can count it though. Is it? No, it doesn't count how many tabs I have. I still have a lot. I still think I have my oldest tab is I think from 2017. So what about like have you had issues with running into the max number of tabs that you can have open on your phone?
No, I haven't. I mentioned when we last had this tab checkup, I was above 100 and I was actually at like 130, 140. That's when the browser on the phone stops counting and just turns into a smiley face.
Actually, it was a smiley face?
Yeah. It's like when we give up. But they stuck around, and I'm kind of proud to say I got that down to 15. So that was definitely part of one of my New Year's resolutions for 2020. So I'm glad to say I'm well on track to get that almost eliminated.
So I actually had a conversation about this recently. My wife has something like if you look at the phone, the little red badges icon on her phone app, she's at like 12. Like she has, I think, 12 unlistened to voicemails that just sit there. She's not going to listen to that. I think it tends to be from family. She's already talked to the person, but she still has those unlistened to voicemails. And the phone is one thing I specifically get down to 0. Between my phone and text messages, I make sure I get those down to 0 pretty regularly. But my emails, my personal Gmail, my unread is just went over 2,000. I don't know if my work email is up around 1,400. So I do think about that. Like sometimes, like why do I care about the phone and the text getting to 0, but the emails, both work and personal, are both in the thousands of unread emails?
Maybe that's a goal you can accomplish. So.
I'm not even bothered. Because I read every email and then I'll leave it. I'll mark as unread if I want to make sure I come back to it.
Yeah.
Like a week later, and doesn't always get deleted or marked as read even after I've taken care of it.
So this might be an episode, strategies on decluttering your technology.
Oh man, I think this. The conversation's worth it because I can feel opening up like a behavioral aspect I don't want to go down. Like I don't want to admit that like my strategy may be inefficient. It's just one of those but that's like human psychology. Like everyone has something like that.
Well, the first step is denial, as we've probably mentioned.
So I think I'm beyond denial. I'm aware of my strategy, and or how inefficient that may be.
Okay. Well, there's hope. We'll get there.
Okay. This was fun. It's good year, Trishul. Good year.
Yeah.
I mean, 2020 sucks, but in terms of the conversations we've had on the podcast, I've enjoyed it.
Well, fully agree. 2020, boo. Podcast, yay.
I think we'll end there. Thank you very much for your time, Trishul. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Aaron. And thanks, everybody, for listening. Again, if you're enjoying this and you keep enjoying these conversations, do spread the word. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye. We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of the Mind Money Spectrum podcast. Be sure to visit mindmoneyspectrum.com to access the entire library of episodes. Remember, it's not black and white, but the wide spectrum of gray area where you get to pursue the freedoms you want in life. Opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested in directly. Have a nice day.